Chapter 40, What a Birthday. Underwood's van, dodging the bigger bushes, with Mrs. Buller hunched over the steering wheel, bumped and bounced across the orphanage grounds. In the distance, the Black Maria, its headlamps glaring, was hurtling round the bend under the railway bridge. Bad Bill pulled the padlock and chain through the wrought iron gates and flung them open. In front of Ida, Baby stopped and stuck out her arm. With a doof in her belly, Ida ran into Baby's arm. Her arm might have been small, but it had the strength of an iron bar. "Wait a sec. Watch," said Baby. With a roaring rev on the engine, Mrs. Buller sped through the orphanage gates, bumped off the curb into the road, and without looking right or left, crashed with an enormous bang and crunch of metal right into the Black Maria, stopping it dead in its tracks. Steam billowed out from under the scrunched bonnet of Underwood's van. Constable Spencer flung open his door and stumbled out to inspect the damage, a huge dent in the empty police van, the Black Maria. As soon as he saw the policeman, Bill dropped the heavy padlock chain and with fists like pistons ran up the West Street, right into the girls. He tried to dodge through them, but he was clumsy and stupid, and they were nimble and clever. Gin leaped onto his back and wrestled him to the ground. "Oh, no, you don't, you coward, Teasdale!" Sophie, Brian and Fingers joined her, helping to pin Bill to the pavement, while Frank and Robert snarled at the horrible young man. "I was only doing me job. You don't know what they're like. Get that dog off me!" Mrs. Buller peeled herself off the steering wheel and leaned against the inside of the driver's door. It fell off its broken hinges and clattered onto the road, and Mrs. Buller, clutching a carpet bag to her chest, rolled out onto all fours, her hair hanging in straggles over her face, like some monstrous creature from the swamp. Ida towered over the horrible woman with her hands on her hips. "Bonnie! Where is Bonnie?" She demanded. "What have you done with her?" "Get out of my way, you stupid girl!" Mrs. Buller, her hair unpinned and her scarf falling off her neck, was trying to stand up. "Ida, it's all right, she's here." Baby yanked at the back doors. They flew open both at once, and moments later Baby appeared with Bonnie in her arms, her golden head resting on Baby's shoulder. "She's all right, just a bit of a bump." Ida flung her arms round them both, Baby and Bonnie, and held them as tight as if they were falling off a cliff, and Ida was the only one who could save them, though with all her heart Ida knew now that no one could have been saved without Baby. Mrs. Buller was uselessly brushing the snow off her jacket. She picked up her carpet bag and wrapped her salmon-pink silk scarf round her neck. "That is my mother's scarf! She has it!" shouted Sergeant Sophie. "She stole it from me in London." Sophie left the others sitting on Bill, shot through the onlookers, and fearlessly yanked her mum's scarf off Mrs. Buller's neck. Frank woofed, and seeming to understand him, Fingers took up snarling and growling at the cowering Bill as Frank followed Sophie and dashed towards Mrs. Buller and the kerfuffle round the crash. "Frank, wait for me!" Robert ran after him. Sergeant Jackson had at last extricated himself from the cab of the Black Maria and staggered round to the steam-hissing undertaker's van. "Now then, this here is criminal damage to a police vehicle, let alone dangerous driving. There's a driving test now, my good woman." Mrs. Buller flicked back her hair with a neat jerk. With blood trickling over her forehead, she hitched up her skirts and, still clutching the carpet bag, made a run for it through the snow. Sergeant Jackson blew his whistle, but it was Frank, the snowy white bullet of a dog that also knew she wasn't to be trusted, who got her. With his ears like the silver lady's wings on a Rolls Royce and his teeth bared, white and shiny, he charged at Mrs. Buller's ankles. Mrs. Buller stumbled, and Frank, his teeth clamped just under her bulbous calves, brought her crashing to the ground. Her carpet bag flew out of her hand, the clasp opened mid-air, and £5 notes like giant snowflakes fluttered onto the crowd that had eagerly followed the action up West Street. Robert, with a glee that could only come from at last being able to get his own back on the despicable woman, and following the girl's example, jumped on her back as if she was the bounciest bed, and Frank, with a fresh snarl especially for her, growled low and menacing in her face, every single one of his teeth gleaming. Ida had never had such a birthday. She had never had such a Christmas. She had never had such friends. She had never been quite as happy. If only Mum could have been there to see it. Though if she had been, would any of this happen? Ida had such a Christmas pudding mix-up of feelings. Miss Lovelock was especially glad she came into work that Saturday afternoon to finish the huge pile of paperwork Mr. Wimpole had given her for the Christmas holidays, paperwork generated by Mrs. Buller to hide her own dishonesty. It turned out that Miss Lovelock had been trying to tell Mr. Wimpole, without getting the sack, that Mrs. Buller was stealing from the council. They called it embezzling, but Mr. Wimpole rather liked Mrs. Buller. "She's a magnificent woman," and actually he had been worried about his job too. Mrs. Buller had lots of friends in high places, lots of Blackshirt friends. "This is exactly why I didn't want to go to the police straight away," explained Ida to everyone, sipping sweet cocoa and unwrapping presents round the enormous Christmas tree in the glittering Nettlefield Grange dining hall. Aggie had just had her best Christmas ever and was a bit overcome by all the excitement, like all the other orphans. Ida marvelled at how changed Nettlefield Grange was. The grim portrait of the man with mutton chop whiskers had gone, and a huge vase of holly and mistletoe decorated the mantelpiece instead. Brightly coloured streamers and paper chains crisscrossed the ceiling. Candles flickered on the windowsills, and presents for the orphans were piled up under the tree, dripping with gold and silver streamers and sparkling with Brian's dad's glass stones from his machine. The tables pushed against the walls, covered in red and green Christmassy cloths, were loaded with food. But perhaps best of all, considering how cold Ida had been for, well, it seemed like forever, an enormous fire crackled and roared in the huge fireplace. The orphan's first Netterfield Christmas had been provided by the very ashamed of himself Mr. Wimpole, and especially jolly Sergeant Jackson, dressed as Father Christmas, and many of the Netterfield shopkeepers. They had raided Mrs. Buller's stores, not just Ida and Robert's cupboard, but at least half a dozen more dotted round the Grange, where she had been stocking up for the Nazi invasion that she and Uncle Arthur believed would surely happen. Brian assured everyone that her dad had told her that the invasion would never happen because he'd checked out the next 80 years or so, and he was confident the only people to invade mainland Great Britain would still be the French in the 1700s. He did also say that in 80 years' time there would be people who would think the country had been invaded, but it absolutely had not. Brian's dad was really bonkers, thought Brian. Brian's dad really was bonkers, though Brian, with Miss Lovelock's and Mr. Wimpole's help, had persuaded the asylum to let him come out for a visit and bring Abel to see his old home in the new year. There was so much to go over and retell, but for now everyone was happy just to enjoy Christmas and perhaps just one tale of the adventure. "Can we have that one again, miss?" asked one of Aggie's friends. "Of course you can, Gerald." Miss Lovelock enjoyed it too, because it was the moment she had waved goodbye to piles of paperwork and her mean landlady. It also meant she was able to bring her mum to live with her as Netterfield's oldest orphan, and best of all, was cheered in as the new matron of Netterfield Grange. The orphans, including Aggie, who really was an orphan, Harry, Sergeant Jackson, Baby, Fingers, Gin, Brian, Sophie, Bonnie, Ida and Robert, who definitely wasn't an orphan, with Frank nestled on his lap, all gathered round the fire to listen one more time. "If you're sitting comfortably," said Miss Lovelock, "I'll begin." After some enthusiastic nodding from her audience, Miss Lovelock did indeed begin. Mrs. Buller thought she got away with it. She didn't realise some brave and clever girls. Bonnie put up a hand. "Miss, Mum called Ida her Wonder Girl." Miss Lovelock nodded at Bonnie. "Yes, that is so true. Mrs. Buller didn't realise that some brave and clever Wonder Girls called Ida, Baby, Florence," Fingers went bright red at hearing her full proper name, "Brenda, Virginia and Sophie had rumbled her plan." The children all turned to beam at the girls sitting at the back with Miss Lovelock's mum in her wheelchair. They blushed at the use of their real names. Miss Lovelock told the story of the evil Blackshirt Uncle Arthur, the race to the docks, Mrs. Buller's failed escape, and of the girls, every one a wonder girl, including Robert, and of course, fearless Frank. She told of Ida, the brilliant mechanic, her thrilling rides in the tugboat and the gyrocopter, and of Baby, the small brown girl with a wisdom well past her years, and a mother's heart big enough for all the kids in peril she was ever going to meet. Miss Lovelock ended her story with how all the other orphans, watching Mrs. Buller's final capture, jumped and cheered for joy, banging on the windows with their fists. "But I ain't an orphan," piped up Robert, waving his arm in the air. "'Cause we're going to find my mum, aren't we, Ida?" "We certainly are." Ida still wasn't sure how, but she was sure that Mr. Wimpole, who was definitely not a black shirt, and was very ashamed of how he was fooled by them, would do anything to help. Frank, who seemed to know that the story was a lot about him, woofed and leapt into Miss Lovelock's lap, his tail wagging like the gyrocopter's propeller. "Even the orphanage cooks and cleaners and gardeners and caretakers," continued Miss Lovelock, "who really didn't like being cruel and mean, came outside in the snow and clattered their pots and pans and brooms and spades. They cheered too when the police took Mrs. Buller away. They even caught a few of her £5 notes. But," Miss Lovelock continued, as a little tear brimmed in her eye, "the biggest cheer was from me, from my heart." She pressed her hand to her chest. "When Mr. Wimpole asked me if I'd like to look after these children, and I said I would love to." Chapter 41. So many happy endings. Miss Lovelock, kind-hearted and loving, the new matron of Netterfield Grange Orphanage, leaned forward in her story chair by the fire. "This has been my best Christmas ever, but now it's time for bed." The children groaned, but as their beds were covered in Mrs. Buller's blankets, furs and quilts, plus one of the orphanage caretakers now had to go round and put a hot water bottle in each bed 10 minutes before bedtime, the children didn't really mind that much. Watching Ida put her arm round her sister to take her up to bed was like an extra hot water bottle for Baby. "I think I'm all right now," said Bonnie. "You can stay down for a bit with the older ones if you like." She hugged Ida extra hard before following brave Aggie up the east wing staircase. "Girls," said Miss Lovelock, "would you like to stay here tonight instead of next door? We have 6 extra beds upstairs in the old matron's dressing room in the west wing. They're all warming with brand new sheets." Miss Lovelock nodded her head, willing them to say yes. "And we have kippers for breakfast." The orphanage handyman had been hard at work repairing the Lily to Abel Sparks, whose secret den it used to be, original design. And while that was going on, the girls had been bunking up in the empty house under the railway bridge with the overgrown garden next door to the orphanage. Fortunately, the trains had stopped for Christmas. "What you say?" Baby looked round at Fingers, Gin, Sophie, Brian and Ida and was met with, "Too right. Fabulous, darling. I would like that. Yes, please. Thank you, I'd love that." "I think that's a yes, miss. So yes, please, we would like to accept your kind invitation," said Baby. "Lovely. I'll leave you to go up when you're ready." In the kindest way, Miss Lovelock carried on shooing the orphans and not orphans like Robert and Frank to bed. Harry, who'd been quiet the whole evening, stood up from the dark corner where he'd been sitting with his back against the wall listening to the story. He came across to Miss Lovelock as she kissed the last child good night. He offered her his arm. "Would you like to take a short stroll in the moonlight, June?" "Why, thank you, Harry. When the children and mother are in bed, I think I would. Could one of you girls put the lights out before you go up, please?" The orphans and not orphans trooped upstairs. A nurse collected Miss Lovelock's mum, and Harry and Miss Lovelock wrapped up for their moonlight stroll. As the big front door creaked, Baby beckoned the girls and Ida into a huddle round the fire. "That's it, as close as you can," said Baby. They pulled their rickety chairs together by the glowing embers in the grate. "We're a gang," said Gin. "How gloriously marvellous." "And I think we have a name," said Sophie, looking each way at the girls. "The Wonder Girls is a spiffing name," said Gin, crossing her legs elegantly. "I like it." Fingers nodded slowly in agreement. So we're stopping for good, are we? Baby's heart lurched. Who knows, Fingers, me old chum, but if we did, would that be all right? Fingers made a little shrug of her shoulders. Suppose. But the shadow of a smile on Fingers' face told Baby it certainly was all right. Brian nodded enthusiastically and tried the name out for size. Yes, the Wonder Girls. It's a good name for good people. But what's your name going to be, Ida? She means your gang name, said Fingers. At the moment, I'm just happy being just Ida, one of the Wonder Girls, she said. Then just Ida it is, said Baby. And Sophie, said Brian, you belonged to this gang the first time Baby told us about you. Brian really was very clever. She just knew things. A tear formed in Sophie's eye. My parents are tailors, so you can call me Stitch. Baby struggled with a lump in her throat too. After all her girls had gone to bed, she stood in the empty hall. She smiled at the card, a picture of the tug cow shot from Ida's friend Alf on the mantelpiece. Baby switched off all the sparkling electric lights and, dragging a chair round with her to stand on, blew out the candles on the windowsills one by one. By the last candle, the one where Harry had sat for Miss Lovelock's story time, Baby picked up a scrap of newspaper off the floor. It was folded like one of her notes. She peeled the folds open. It was the most evil, cold-hearted devil of them all, Herr Hitler, holding a little girl that could so easily have been Bonnie. It wasn't the Blackshirt's lightning strike on the paper, but the symbol they'd stolen from her people. Baby screwed it up, marched over to the grate and threw it on the fire. It burst into flame and was gone, but it left a strange shadow over her heart. Kids are never going to be safe until those Blackshirts, Nazis and everyone like them have been sent packing. She stepped up on her chair to blow out the last candle and through the window saw Mr. Pilot Harry take Miss Lovelock's hands in his. The shadow retreated to some dark, faraway corner, and Wonder Girl Baby felt as warm as one of old Lady Jup's buns, fresh out the oven, at all the happy endings. The end.